alone in the dark. And my brothers and sisters died here. They died without me. I swore. We all swore. We swore to stand and fight and die. Together. Together. The Emperor. High Rider Dog Filth. When Horus called, I gave my word. I gave my word because I lived when I should have died. That's no gift. He made me a traitor. He made me betray the only oath that mattered. I lived and my brothers and sisters died here. Their bones left for the vermin, the wind, the snow.
Angron is nothing more than a creature of rage, purely driven by hatred and the desire to destroy everything that the Emperor built. During the Horus heresy, he gave himself fully to the blood god Khorne, and has remained in the service of the chaos god since. While many believe the most tragic of all the primarchs' tales will be that of Magnus the Red, the loyal son whose mistake cost both the future of the Imperium as well as his homeworld, it was his own mistake that drove him down that path. It was him believing that in the end he knew better, and took a risk in order to do what he felt was right. In his attempt, he destroyed any chance that the Webway project could be completed easily, and also made it almost impossible for the Emperor to take part in the war against Horus. He also doomed himself, his legion, and his homeworld. Yes, the Emperor made a drastic error, not telling perhaps the only son who would understand his intentions for the Webway. But the Emperor's error in not telling Magnus about the Webway project pales in comparison to the handling of Angron. Not in universal impact, for Angron was simply one of 9 who turned on the Emperor, but personal impact. Of all the primarchs who sided with Horus in the war, the only one who did not truly betray him in the end was John C. Give me a second.
Hey, you remember how I told you I wanted to make out of a serious video this time instead of all the jokes and stuff? Yes, Commissar. Yeah, next time remember that.
As I was saying, the only one of the primarchs that did not actually betray the Emperor was Angron, because you cannot betray someone if you have no loyalty to them in the first place. The Emperor loved mankind, that much is certain, but he did not have the ability to place himself in the shoes of others. He was masterful at reading them, seeing their wants and desires, but at the end of the day, if he decided to acknowledge those feelings, it was purely to placate and not out of empathy. He had the ability to reason with even the most unreasonable. But again, it was up to him when he would use this gift, and he only used it either when he had the time or was curious. We see this in the short story, The Last Church. In this story, the Emperor, cloaking himself using his psychic abilities, speaks with the last priests on Terra during the Unification Wars. The Emperor, despite his vast knowledge and wisdom, was still trying to grasp why some humans clung to religion, even at the expense of their lives. He debated the priest for hours, deconstructing his arguments, promoting his own ideas. Even as the priest persisted in his faith, when the Emperor made the point that religion had been used to justify wholesale theft and genocide, the priest had had enough, and may go down as the only human in history to tell the Emperor to get the hell off his property.
Do me a favour, off outside, get a big deep breath of fresh air. Piss off. Yeah. Go on, outside, outside. Hey, look at me, off.
The Emperor then took off his psychic mask, showing himself to the priest, who then realized that the very event that had turned him down the path of religion had been nothing more than the Emperor speaking to him in the distant past. The Emperor, for his part, had decided to recruit the priest into his ranks, admiring him for his intelligence and assertiveness. But as the Emperor explained his vision for mankind to the priest opted instead to die alongside his church. He saw the truth that the Emperor did not. The Emperor could never understand religion because for him there were no questions that needed answering. There was no disquiet or discomfort in the face of the unknown. There was no uncertainty or doubt. There was no weakness, fear, or doubt in his own abilities. How would one explain the comfort of faith to someone who has no doubt? How would you explain the feeling of being weak to someone who has always been stronger than any adversary? How do you explain the feeling of powerlessness to that which is almost all-powerful. The Emperor did not and could not understand faith, even though he actually wanted to, because the reasons that people turned to faith were completely absent from him. He lacked the context, and for some matters, context is all that matters. Such was the case with Angron. In the older lore, Angron was a figure shrouded in a good deal of mystery. While it was clear he joined the Horus heresy and that he had been afflicted with something called the Butcher's Nails, not much else was known about him save for the fact that he was a demon primarch of Khorne, and that he was a mindless berserker. The Horus heresy has brought a good deal of backstory to this son of the Emperor, and while Magnus the Red has for a long time been considered the saddest story of all the primarchs, Angron's own tale eclipses it tenfold. While Magnus fell by the need to save himself and his sons after an error in judgment, Angron was doomed from childhood, and the only one that could have saved him from the lot that fate had drawn for him only drove the blade in further, turning a dangerous wound into a mortal one. Many of the primarchs and other figures within the early lore of 40k are based on religion, fiction, or real-life people. A few notable comparisons are that of Rabute Guilliman and Marcus Aurelius, Sanguinius and Jesus, Conrad Curse and Batman crossed with Vlad the Impaler, Lorgar with any fucktard in any family known to exist.
Which every family does. Every family has a fucktard in it. And if you can't think of who it is, it's you.
The list goes on. Angron had the most direct comparison with all of them, however, as his match in history is Spartacus. Spartacus was a Thracian man who at some point prior to his enslavement was an auxiliary in the Roman army, and upon being enslaved was sold to a gladiatorial school in the city of Capua, called a ludus. The ludus belonged to a man named Lentinius Batiatus, forgive my butchered pronunciation. Sometime after his enslavement, Spartacus planned an escape with the help of his fellow gladiators Crixus, Gannicus, Costus, and Onomius. Spartacus led the slave revolt, but historians argue over his intentions, with many Roman contemporaries claiming that he intended to march on Rome, although now that is up to speculation. The numbers of Spartacus's army swelled as he marched towards Cisalpine Gaul, defeating 2 consular armies before having to fall back towards central Italy. The Romans placed command of the 2 defeated consular armies as well as several thousand reinforcements in the hands of Marcus Crassus. Under Crassus's leadership, the Romans eventually drove the slave army until Spartacus brought his remaining strength to bear in the Battle of the Scialas River. Spartacus's entire army was defeated, but his body was never found, although all the contemporary historians claimed that Spartacus had been killed. With that out of the way, let us now look at the personal history of Angron. During the scattering of the primarchs, thanks, Erda.
So I'd like to thank my mom.
Especially my mom.
My mom.
My mother.
My mother, mi madre.
I'm too pissed to give a shit, bitch! Bitch!
Angron came to rest on the world of Nuceria, which was most likely in the Ultima Segmentum. Soon after he emerged from his gestation capsule, he was found by a local slaver, who found him almost mortally wounded and surrounded by multiple Xenos corpses. The Primarch was subdued, chained, and enslaved, which even with the Primarch being so young would have been an impossible task considering their capabilities. We can only assume that he was barely clinging to life, and the slaver themselves used extensive failsafes to ensure the Primarch didn't add to his tally of bodies. The word used to describe the amount of the dead was scores, which usually means a group of 20. At the very least, if the slaver was being completely honest with the number, the gross minimum number of Xeno dead at the hands of the newly emerged Primarch was 40. Let us take a moment to admire the sheer balls of this slaver, who came on a battlefield where there were a bunch of corpses, and in the middle of that was a large child who had apparently killed them all with a rock in his bare hands. And instead of saying, "Fuck this shit, I'm leaving," he decided to enslave the child. To those who still haven't grasped what I'm saying the following. Primarchs are so powerful that one that at best could be compared to a 5-year-old human massacred upwards of 40 trained Xeno warriors. And who were these warriors that I speak of? The fucking Eldar.
I'm sorry, your blood
One of those
pressure.
knife-eared shits with the ability to see the future, snort a light of chems, and dreamed that Angron was going to turn into Mega Satan, and he decided to do something about it. Did he go all out? No. He literally had a vision that this kid was going to turn into Mega Satan, and instead of doing what any rational, advanced spacefaring civilization would do, and simply shooting giant fuck-off lasers from orbit on him until there wasn't an atom left, he just sent a bunch of infantry and thought, it'll be fine, before he fucked off back to lamenting about the time his great aunt shoved a pint pineapple up her ass and birthed the
Commissar.
Chaos God. That's fucking it.
May the Emperor bless you all. The Commissar is resting now. I would like to thank you all for tuning into the Voxcast today. If you are enjoying today's Voxcast, please leave a like on this video and subscribe if you haven't already. The Commissar also has decided to open a Patreon, so if you feel so inclined, check the description down below. Yes, Commissar, no knife ears, only dreams.
Oh, by the God, Emperor, my head. Thank you once more, Sister Evelyn. Okay, now what was I talking about? Right. Angron was taken to the city of Daesha and was immediately thrown into a gladiatorial pit, where he was forced to kill everyone for himself to survive. He was bought by the rulers of the city, who also happened to own the arena, and was given their name, Valkyr, which meant Child of the Mountain. After being nursed back to health, he drew a score of victories for the arena, quickly becoming known as the Unbeaten, and he came to seemingly enjoy the love of the crowds, even though he continuously tried to escape. He was a fan favorite, and under his leadership the arena prospered, even as he gained a reputation for being an honorable fighter. An older gladiator by the name of Onomias became his mentor and father figure, and the two were paired as a seemingly father and son team, reaping a massive string of victories in the arena. He hated those who owned him, attempting to break out often, but he loved his fellow gladiators, often calling them his brothers and sisters. He was extremely attached to them, celebrating their victories and training them to be the best they could possibly be. All of that changed one day as Angron and Onomias fought two Angron berserkers who had been implanted with the archaeotech known as the Butcher's Nails. After defeating the Angron, the ruling class of the city joyfully demanded the two victors fight to the death. Angron flatly refused, defying and insulting his masters, and as punishment he was surgically implanted with the Butcher's Nails. The Butcher's Nails were designed to boost adrenaline production and reduce serotonin to breed purely instinctual aggression, and at the same time it doled out other emotional responses. Implanted in a normal human, the nails would have been a diabolical means of control. Surgically implanted in a primarch, they became a time bomb, causing damage that would hinder higher brain function at the same time it rewired most of the primarch's emotional responses. The moment that the nails were implanted in Angron's head, his death was certain, because the Butcher's Nails were not designed for something that complex. The more Angron's body tried to heal, the deeper the nails bit into his mind, in a back-and-forth struggle that would eventually destroy the central nervous system. Ignorant to this, the ruling class completed the implantation process and turned him loose on Onomias. Angron, overwhelmed by the impulses from the nails, killed his foster father in a fit of blind rage. When he finally regained his senses and saw what he had done, he howled like an animal for days. His foster father's death caused him to lead a revolt, and many of his fellow gladiators joined him. His slave army broke out of the city, living in the mountains and destroying any army that came for him. During their time plundering the countryside, they became known as the Eaters of Cities. Eventually, though, 7 large armies began to surround Angron's small force. Starvation set in, and Angron, even though afflicted by the nails, loved his fellow gladiators so much he was willing to feed them with blood from his own veins to keep them alive. Facing numerical superiority that not even a primarch could overcome, Angron prepared to face death alongside his brothers and sisters. This is when the Emperor arrived, after having watched Angron's revolt for some months from orbit. The Emperor and a small force of custodians landed among Angron's slave army, and he was offered command of the 12th Space Marine Legion and a place at the Emperor's side. Even as shocked as Angron was, he refused, saying his place was at the side of his brothers and sisters. The Emperor's chest swelled with pride as he looked at his son, and the order was given. Drop pods and thunderhawks began to rain from the skies, and Angron looked to his father as his father looked out over the approaching armies. "If your place is at their side, then I am at yours, my son," the Emperor said, even as the first of what was to be Angron's legion began to flood from their landers. Angron staggered back as the nails attempted to bite, replacing the washing sensation of awe, gratitude with the typical rage and hate, as all around him, in numbers that seemed to grow unending, figures in power armor knelt to him. Some helmetless heads so cheeks streaked with tears and joy. "Who are they?" whispered Angron, his breath sullen by the sight, even as his brothers and sisters around him drew closer, shock and confusion showing clear on their face. They are your legion, your space marines, the Emperor said, slowly looking back to him. They are your sons as you are mine. Stand with me, Angron. Stand with me and we will take this world, make it a better one. Stand with me, Angron, and we will do this for the entire galaxy. Angron's face twitched as the nails did everything in their power to override his emotions. He suddenly found himself on his knees. A strange sensation drove the ever-present bite of the nails. Joyous cries echoed off the mountain from the starved and exhausted slaves, even as the armies below seemed to wave like blown grass. The men and then suddenly fearful. The Emperor then turned to Angron and his army. Stand with me, and I will stand with all of you. The mountainside thundered as the arenas once had with the sound of his name. We are the eaters of cities, whispered a young gladiator next to Angron. But they, she whispered through a smile, they are the eaters of worlds. Angron's hand came down on her shoulder. We have won, my sister, he whispered to her. Then Angron stepped away from his brothers and sisters to stand at the side of his newly found father. His father said nothing for a time as Angron watched what was to be his legion rapidly assemble for war, his face still twitching as the implants tried to suppress his emotions. You would have died with them, wouldn't you? Angron looked to his father's question, to the ragtag slaves who were still chanting his name, now standing in some cases shoulder to shoulder with the space marines. He nodded slowly. The Emperor closed his eyes. Such nobility, such honor. You and your legion will do great things, my son.
So bullshit! All of it!
None of that actually happened. Let's rewind. Even as shocked as Angron was, he refused, saying his place was at the side of his brothers and sisters. The Emperor, stunned by this rejection, turned and boarded his Stormbird, leaving the planet and returning to his flagship. As the battle between the planet's armies and Angron's slaves began, the Emperor gave the order to teleport Angron into a hold aboard the Conqueror. Angron could only sit in a holding cell in an incoherent rage as everyone that he had fought alongside, respected, and loved was slaughtered. The Custodes, having surrounded him once he met the Emperor, lowered their weapons at him. Angron promptly killed one of them, ready to turn on the Emperor. Suddenly he was forced to his knees and placed in a position of submission, the Emperor having used his psychic might to stop the violence. Angron demanded to know why the Emperor hadn't intervened to save his people, but the Emperor dismissed the question out of hand. He said he was the Emperor and he was set on the galaxy, not battling a few petty tyrants for a few slaves. Angron bitterly roared that he was meant to die with those slaves, but now only a ghost remained. The Emperor replied to him that for what he had planned for Angron, a ghost would suffice. If the Emperor had wanted a loyal son, a leader, and a proud example for the 12th Legion to rally behind, I can't imagine a worse way to go about setting that up. If the Emperor wanted a blood enemy, the only thing he could have done to make it worse would be to have the Custodes slaughter his slave army while he pinned Angron with his psychic might and forced him to watch. In a time span that could have only been a few hours, the Emperor had allowed everyone that Angron loved to die, spit on everything that Angron was and had fought for, dishonored him, forced him into submission, stripped him of his dignity, and insulted the memory of those that had bled alongside of him. That is how you make a mortal enemy, but the Emperor didn't see it that way, actually saying that he hoped one day Angron would understand. Spoiler alert, Angron gave two shits about the Emperor's reasoning. The Emperor couldn't understand. Why would a figure such as one of his primarchs care so much about slaves? Why did Angron want to do something so foolish as to die alongside those said slaves when there was so much more waiting in the stars? He understood the nature of the butcher's nails in Angron's head, but he simply couldn't understand why his newly found son hated him so much. The Emperor had come upon his son in the midpoint of the crusade. He was the 17th Primarch to be found and the only one that had not become the ruler of the world on which they had landed. This was mostly due to the Eldar having attacked him, wounding him so greatly he wasn't able to resist those that enslaved him. The Emperor was already beginning to turn his attentions toward the Webway project that was a full century in the future, and although compliance on Nuceria, the planet that Angron had landed on, would have been a simple matter to the Emperor, he simply didn't have the patience, especially when the world was already leaning toward compliance anyway. In the Emperor's eyes, why wage a war when war doesn't need to be waged? He couldn't put himself in Angron's position because he had never been close to it. He didn't understand the camaraderie of his son and the slaves. What's more, the Emperor certainly didn't grasp what he had actually done. Angron had survived enslavement and the butcher's nails, and he had done it all with his honor intact. He had vowed to die alongside his fellow slaves, and the Emperor had made him break that vow. In Angron's own words, the Emperor made him a traitor and an oath-breaker. The Emperor had come to a nearly compliant world and found his son fighting a losing war. And although the lore says he looked on Angron with pride, what's clear is he didn't understand his son. Just as the Emperor couldn't understand faith, he couldn't understand why his creation refused to join him and would rather stand, fight, and die with a rabble of slaves. This is why it's important to see this decision in context with the attitude and outlook of the Emperor. From the Emperor's view, Angron should have been pleased to join him, pleased to see his goals being carried out. Angron should have leapt at the chance to command his legion, as had all of his brothers before him. He shouldn't be angry over the deaths of some slaves. To the Emperor, what was the point? Humans died all the time. The Emperor was different. Angron was different. Why did his creation not see that? Finally, we come to the real heart of the matter. What happened to Angron afterwards when he traveled with the Emperor to Terra? Angron was dying from the effects of the butcher's nails, his advanced biology being the cause. The nails were degrading his mental facilities at a rapid pace, destroying his higher brain functions, and rewiring his emotional stimuli entirely. It was rapidly approaching the point where the mere act of living was pure agony to the Primarch. Almost all of the chemicals that dictated emotions had been deadened, except for anger, which flowed freely. Anger was the only thing the Primarch could take any sort of pleasure from. Everything caused Angron pain, even breathing. What's very telling is that the Emperor thought that he could remove the nails, but decided not to because of how difficult it would be considering how integrated the implants were into Angron's mind. He chose not to in the end because of the risk of losing one of his Primarchs that could, for the time being, still lead an army. Most newly found Primarchs and their legions shadowed under another established Primarch and their legion, often to ensure that the newly found general understood how the Great Crusade was to be carried out. Not Angron, who was given direct control of his legion almost immediately upon leaving the Emperor's side on Terra. I discussed in detail in the first Voxcast that the Emperor viewed his son as tools. The Emperor saw Angron as a broken tool, and wanted to get as much use out of him as possible before the end. Whatever Angron might have been as a leader and as a general, we will never know. What the Emperor did ensured that at the very first opportunity Angron would turn on him. Even as damaged as Angron was, he still could have been saved, but the only one to extend him a hand in friendship was fucking Lorgar. What was the Emperor's mistake here? Impatience, hubris, and a complete lack of humility. Angron knew brotherhood from watching the backs of his friends, both women and men, who even though he was so superior to them, still watched his own. Angron knew the honor that came from adversity, knew the taste of defeat and pain, and the nobility of facing down an enemy that he had no chance of winning against. Even fighting against the ever-present agony of the butcher's nails, Angron knew sacrifice and love. Actually opening his arteries to keep his brothers and sisters alive even for another day, even as they awaited the 7 armies that would eventually put them all to the sword. The Emperor unintentionally destroyed that man, ripping out his nobility and honor in a single decision. The Emperor's mistake turned that man into this.
The difference between gods and demons largely depends on where one is standing at the time.
What a crock of shit.